All right, last week we looked at all of the most important diagrams and graphs that you need for the macroeconomics exam for 2020. And today we are going to look at all of the important models that you need for this year's microeconomics exam. So here we go. All right, so I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time going over the first unit again with the production possibilities, but you do need that for micro as well. Comparative advantage, absolute advantage, that's also part of the basic economic concepts required for the macro and the micro exam. Not going to go over it again. Now with micro, there is more of a focus on market supply and demand. I'm not going to go over timer and rat nest, the shift factors again with you this week, but we are going to start going over the expansion of supply and demand as it applies to utility and elasticity. So we looked at this last week with video games and shortages, surpluses, shifting demand, shifting supply, the effects on the equilibrium price and quantity. All of that stuff is super important for micro. Make sure you know it all. Dual shifts. Remember when supply and demand shift in the same direction? Price is indeterminate, supply and demand at the same time shift in opposite directions, then quantity is indeterminate, all of that stuff. Now when it comes to deadweight loss, identifying areas of consumer surplus and producer surplus, that's something that you do see more so on the micro exam. So just recognizing that a price ceiling, like a rental ceiling, classic example, that would cause changes in consumer surplus, producer surplus, and then cause deadweight loss. That's the inefficiency, the lost consumer surplus, the lost producer surplus in the market due to the government's action. Member ceilings have to go below equilibrium for them to be binding, just like we said last week, and price floors need to go above the market equilibrium to be binding and to have an effect. So the ceiling will cause a shortage and the floors will cause a surplus. All right, so the new stuff. When we started talking about micro, after we took our big macro midterm or macro final exam, we started things off by talking about diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility that applies to everything. In class we said it applies to taco consumption. And then I gave you some interesting, life stories and so on. I'm not going to get into it. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. Not going to get into marriage. Nope. But anyway, when total utility increases at a decreasing rate, we have diminishing marginal utility. That this had to do with the waters and the diamonds paradox that we had mentioned. We all agreed in class that if you add up the total happiness, the total utility, the total satisfaction of water throughout your lifetime, that should be much larger than the total amount of happiness and satisfaction from consuming diamonds in your lifetime. However, the value does lie at the margin, that the high price of diamonds isn't only due to scarcity, it's also due to the fact that the last diamond that you consume is going to have a higher marginal value to you than the last, cup of water that you consume. So when total utility increases at a decreasing rate, that means that the marginal benefit, the marginal satisfaction is decreasing. That's diminishing marginal utility. That is why the demand curve slopes downward in any market, or any product market at least. As prices fall, quantity demanded increases, and that's because the marginal utility of the next unit purchased is going to be less than the previous unit. Cool? Cool. How many units should you buy? What if you want to purchase shirts? What if you want to purchase handbags, with your income when you go to the store? So you consider what's the marginal utility over the price of the good, instead of equal to the marginal utility of the other good over the price of the good. So because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, if you need to reduce the ratio, you do have to purchase more units. We just talked about this with factor markets as well, except with factor markets we used marginal revenue product instead of marginal utility, or we used the marginal product instead of marginal utility. And in that case, if we wanted to reduce the ratio, we hired more workers or we employed more capital because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. So the law of diminishing marginal utility is the consumer's version of diminishing marginal returns. So if the MU over P is too high, buy more. If the MU over P needs to come up, you buy less. In the market, we remember this. You have a market equilibrium right down the middle, equilibrium price P, and quantity Q. So the area under the demand, always, the area under the demand curve but above the price that is paid, that represents the market's consumer surplus, and it's usually a neat little triangle for the purpose of the AP exam. Producer surplus, that's always the area that is above the supply curve but under the price of the good. So it's the price that the seller receives, the difference the price the seller receives, minus the price that they're willing to sell for. So we say that the sum of the consumer and the producer surplus is maximized when a free market is in equilibrium, like you see here, that there's no government involvement whatsoever, and also assuming that there are no negative or positive externalities in the market. Now, for the 2020 exam, it appears that they had taken off a lot about the positive and the negative externality stuff. So we're not going to focus much on that today. At this point of the course, we talked about the elasticity of demand, talked about the Martin Shkreli example with Daraprim and treating toxoplasmosis, and why he was such a villain, especially on the internet, several years back. The basic formula for the elasticity of anything goes like this. You have the percent change in the quantity in the numerator, you divide it by the percent change in the price. The basic formula of elasticity for just about anything. So for the elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of demand, we say the percent change in the quantity demanded is in your numerator, and divide that by the percent change in the price of the product, the price along the demand curve. So when this elasticity of demand is greater than 1, that indicates we have elastic demands, that consumers are responding strongly to a change in price. We also did the total revenue test, meaning that if the price goes up and the total revenue falls, that is telling us that the elasticity of demand is responsive, it's elastic. Now, inelastic demand occurs when the elasticity of demand, the coefficient, is less than 1. So if price and total revenue move in the same direction, we're saying consumers are not very responsive to a change in the price of the good. Here, we're going to make the link between the demand curve for the product. So demand is average revenue. That's how demand is derived. It's the total revenue over quantity in the market. So demand is average revenue. And then in this market, the marginal revenue is the slope of the total revenue curve. So this should look familiar when we talked about monopolies in class. Remember, I had you put down this diagram in your notes, and I said, make sure you put the total revenue curve directly underneath. And most of you listened. Some of you were too cool to listen and did it side by side, but whatever, do what you want. But anyway, the total revenue curve should line up perfectly where the marginal revenue is 0, where it crosses the x-axis. That's where total revenue is maximized. The slope is 0. When marginal revenue turns negative, that's when we're in the inelastic region of the demand curve. So if you're reading it from right to left, as the price increases, right to left, as price increases, the total revenue rises. When total revenue is at its highest point, we have the unitary elastic demand where marginal revenue is 0, and then as the price continues to rise past that point, the total revenue falls, and vice versa. When you're on the left and the price falls, total revenue rises. That's elastic demand. As the price continues to fall, the total revenue will then fall as the marginal revenue is negative. So important quick relationship there, and like I said, we see this when we talk about monopolies, since the monopolist demand curve is the market's demand curve. Now, in terms of figuring out what types of goods are elastic or inelastic from the consumer perspective, so we say demand is price elastic when there are many substitutes, a lot of alternatives that they're not necessities, and goods that are luxury items. If they take up a large percentage of one's income, tends to be more price elastic. Also, the longer the time frame, the longer the time consumers have to adjust to market conditions, that also would tell us that demand is more price elastic. Elasticity of demand should be less than 1 when you're working with goods in general that are necessities or goods that are not very expensive, goods that take up a small percentage of one's income. It's like a pack of chewing gum, something like that. Now, when we talk about elasticity, it's all relative, one curve relative to another curve. So we have relatively elastic demand curve in the top left. Elastic demand curves will be flatter than inelastic demand curves, which are steeper. So that we have a steeper, relatively more inelastic demand curve in the top right, and then we have the two extreme cases on the bottom, where you have the perfect elastic demand curve in the bottom left. That would be like a perfectly competitive firm's demand curve, which is the marginal revenue, pretty much your Mr. Darp line. Your perfectly elastic horizontal Mr. Darp line is an example of that. And then in the bottom right, you have perfectly inelastic demand where there are absolutely no substitutes whatsoever for the product. So remember, when we look at the extreme cases like perfectly elastic demand, what that means is that if the price was to increase beyond that demand curve in the slightest bit, like by a cent, then nobody should demand that product because they can get infinite quantities at the lower market price. So infinite quantities are demanded up until the price of the good, up until the demand curve, but nobody buys above it. Other types of elasticities, like I said, the numerator is always the percent change in the quantity for how we're using elasticities in this course. So the income elasticity of demand, the percent change in the quantity demanded, it's at the top, percent change in income's on the bottom. If you have a positive value, we're working with normal goods. If we have a negative value for income elasticity, they are inferior goods. Cross elasticity or cross price elasticity of demand is the percent change in quantity demanded of one good divided by the percent change in price of the other good. For cross price elasticity, we're trying to figure out, are the goods substitutes, complements, or unrelated? So a positive value, a positive cross price elasticity tells us that the two goods are substitutes, and a negative value indicates that they're complements. And if the number is close to 0, no relationship. The elasticity of supply on the bottom, from the seller's perspective, if it's greater than 1, it's elastic, less than 1, it's inelastic. The longer the time frame, time is probably the most important factor here, or the complexity of the production process as a key indicator. That more elastic, longer the period of time, more complicated the production process, be less elastic. Time tends to show up a lot on the test, but I don't know how it's going to show up this year, being that it's mostly a free response type of exam. All right, so marginal product and average product. This applies to the law of diminishing marginal returns. This is getting into the cost of production business, like when we made our marshmallow towers, when we worked with the ping pong balls and we were carrying them across the room, that visual, those activities. So marginal product initially increases, then comes down. When marginal product falls, that's the law of diminishing marginal returns. Diminishing marginal returns as it applies to resources, the productivity of our economic resources. So here the x-axis is labor, the quantity of labor. And at the margin, if we add the variable laborers, the variable inputs, to fixed capital, at some point, the marginal product will have to decrease. Average product is just the total product over the quantity of the resources. Average product will be at its highest point when it intersects the marginal product curve. The marginal product curve, if you kind of get a mirror image of it, kind of looks like would be like a marginal cost curve, because then you're factoring in the amount that is being produced and the price of the product, the cost of the product. Average product, if you flip it, if you mirror it, it would look kind of like an average cost curve. So in terms of costs, the key costs that you would have to sketch out if you're doing a firm from in the product market would be average total cost and average variable cost. Those are your U-shaped curves. Average total cost is just the ratio of total cost to output. Average fixed cost ratio to output. Average variable cost divided by output, the Q. Marginal cost is the most important cost that we stress in class, of course. Marginal cost is equal to the change in total cost of the change in output. Remember, marginal just means delta, just like was marginal propensities back in macro. Marginal cost, marginal product, marginal utility, change in total over the change in output, and marginal revenue, change in the total revenue over the change in output, which gets us to the most important rule in micro, which is the MR equals MC rule, where firms would maximize profits where marginal revenue is greater than or equal to the marginal cost of production. So visually, the three most common cost curves that you would have to sketch out on the exam: marginal cost, typically expressed as a check mark or Nike swoosh. Sometimes on the AP exam, they'll just make it an upward sloping curve to make some of the math easier. And sometimes they'll give you a monopoly curve or an imperfectly competitive firm, and they'll say that the marginal cost is equal to the average total cost as a horizontal line. Don't let that confuse you, but if they ever ask you to sketch out the marginal cost, average total cost, or average variable cost curves, these are the typical shapes that you are going to be working with. Remember that the minimum ATC and the minimum AVC must be at the marginal cost curve, and as output increases, the distance between the ATC and the AVC get closer and closer together, because that distance between the ATC and the AVC is represented as the average fixed costs. And average fixed costs are just a decreasing cost curve, because you're taking the same total fixed amount and dividing it by greater and greater quantities. They don't really ever ask you to sketch out the average fixed cost curve, but if for some reason they do, we did a couple examples in class. I've never seen that done before on the AP exam. But these are the three big ones that you want to stick with when it comes to sketching out the cost curves for a firm. So MR equals MC. It doesn't matter if we are a perfectly competitive firm, monopolistically competitive firm, oligopoly, chop and broccoli, or a monopolist. So here is a perfectly competitive firm that I'm going to talk more about this in a couple of seconds, perfect competition in general. But here I just want to take note of this, because this comes up a lot on the AP exam. The effects of per unit taxes versus lump sum taxes. If you see the term lump sum, it just means fixed. It's a fixed. So if there's a fixed tax affects fixed costs. Therefore, a fixed tax, a lump sum tax, doesn't affect the marginal costs. So marginal costs and variable costs are unaffected by one lump sum fixed tax. But the total cost would change, which could change the area of economic profit. So important just to take note of that now. If you see a per unit tax, meaning for each unit that is produced by a firm in any industry, that does shift marginal cost, variable cost, and also the average total cost. So the key takeaway from the slide would be lump sum taxes don't affect the amount of output that a firm should produce in the short run. Per unit taxes, based on the firm theory, do affect the amount of output that the firm produces, because it changes the marginal costs. If we're talking about subsidies and taxes, same thing occurs. Lump sum subsidies, marginal costs are constant, so it only affects the total cost, but a per unit tax would therefore, oh wait a second, the bottom one should say per unit subsidy, not per unit tax, so ignore that. So assuming that these are both subsidies, lump sum subsidies at the top, fixed, and then the bottom per unit, the per unit subsidies would increase output because results in lower marginal costs, and therefore the MR equals MC point is to the right. Mob B. Economies of scale applies to the long run average total cost curve. So you think of it as a big U-shaped curve, essentially. Economies of scale is what occurs when output's increasing in the early stages of production, but the long run costs are falling. Long run average costs are falling. And then diseconomies of scale as production becomes more large scale. As output continues to increase, the longer run average total costs increase. And then somewhere between economies of scale and diseconomies of scale would be constant returns. Here, the constant returns is a little exaggerated. It's nice. It's kind of nice just to keep things all even. But the constant returns to scale phase can be much smaller and narrower than what you see here. So economies of scale can help explain why it's difficult, to compete against, oligopoly firms or a market structure that is monopolized, because a lot of times those firms have so many resources and so much financial capital that it's just too difficult to compete against, and that's because they have economies of scale over a much larger range of output. So just be familiar with how the curve looks, long-run average total cost curves looks for firms. So perfect competition. This was the situation where you have many firms selling the same exact products. The firm's the price taker because the market sets the price. Ease of entry, it's quite simple. From an economic efficiency standpoint, it's the most efficient. Firms break even in the long run. Classic examples, agriculture, although no perfect example exists. For slides like this, if you need to copy anything down, just hit the pause button, of course, to take whatever notes you have, but I'm not going to spend much time on that because we want the diagrams. So if we were to show a short-run economic profit under perfect competition, this is what it looks like for the firm. Mr. DARP, marginal revenue, you horizontal line. Mr. DARP, marginal revenue, firm's demand, average revenue, the price that it's going to sell its product for. Mr. DARP, the P, the MR line that you see, that's set by the market. So it's quite common that we would put the market firm, not the market firm, but put the market, the industry graph, to the left of the firm to show that the equilibrium price in the market lines up perfectly with the MR equals P line. So this is an economic profit because the MR equals MC point. That is greater than the average total cost. Make sure when you're sketching these out that the average variable and average total cost minimums are at the marginal cost curve. So the per unit economic profit is the price point on the MR equals MC line straight down to the ATC, and you carry that on over. This is when we did that fancy shading in class, when I used the smartboard magic in the front of the classroom. The total revenue is the price times quantity, so that includes everything. And then the total cost is all that white space below the profit line for the firm. So short-run economic profits mean that in the long run, we should expect more firms to enter the industry, and then the firm would break even. If a firm is incurring short-run economic losses, the MR equals MC point should be greater than the average variable cost curve, but less than the average total cost curve. So you take the price, follow it straight up to the ATC, and then that area, that blue shaded region, that's the short-run economic loss. If firms are experiencing short-run losses, in the long run, the least efficient firms exit the industry, and then the firm ends up breaking even. The shutdown case means that the firm will produce 0 units in the short run, and that's when the price can't cover the variable costs. However, the firm will still lose the fixed cost of production. In the long run, a lot of the firms that had to shut down in the short run may have to exit the industry altogether. Long run equilibrium is where the MR equals MC point hits the minimum average total cost curve. So we have productive efficiency, price equals minimum ATC, and we also have allocative efficiency, or what's socially ideal, because price equals marginal cost. Monopoly, so jump into the other side of the market. So perfect competition, hundreds and thousands of sellers. Now the monopoly, just one firm selling a unique product. So we're moving from the price-taking firms of perfect competition to the price-making firm under a monopoly. Highly inefficient from a textbook economic example. High barriers to entry because they can enjoy economies of scale over large range or output. Higher profits in the long run. Utilities are a classic example, although of course utilities are regulated. So here's an unregulated monopolist earning economic profits. Could be short run, could be long run, doesn't say. So here, this was where we took that elevator up. Notice how demand and marginal revenue are separate, because the firm's demand curve is the market's demand curve. Marginal revenue, and marginal revenue is positive, we have elastic demand. Where marginal revenue is negative, we have inelastic demand. So MR equals MC. Find where MR equals MC, where the yellow line hits the red marginal cost curve. Find that point and take that elevator straight up to the demand curve, because that's going to give us the price that the firm is going to sell its output at. So the P is the price on the demand curve. That corresponds to the Q, the MR equals MC output level. So the price, that dot that you see on the demand curve, take that straight down to the average total cost curve, follow it on back, and that's the area of economic profit. The area of consumer surplus could also be easily identifiable here, because that would be above price, but under the blue demand curve. And then that neat little triangle that you see from the price point to the marginal cost equals demand point to the MR equals MC point, that represents the deadweight loss, which you're all pretty good at identifying at this point, I think. Deadweight loss is typically that triangle that you want to look for that points right to Mickey D's, the socially optimal price equals marginal cost point. So, like I said, some important monopoly points. There's the area of total revenue in the top left, area of total costs, the top right. Bottom left is your deadweight loss shaded in, and then the bottom right is your consumer surplus. Economic losses, the only difference here visually is that you put the ATC above the price that the monopolist is selling for. Make sure the minimum ATC is on the marginal cost curve. We would also probably put an average variable cost that is below the demand curve, below the price, because you want to show that the monopolist would cover the variable cost of production to stay open. If a monopolist is regulated to produce at the socially optimal level of output, this is where it should be, where the MC equals D, price equals marginal cost. This is allocatively efficient. If this was a competitive market, a perfectly competitive market, this is where we would end up, where marginal cost equals demand. But monopolies do not have the incentive to produce at the socially optimal level, so the government would have to provide some sort of incentive to get them to produce at Mickey D's. The break-even point, or the fair return price, is another regulation point. That's a possibility. If the firm was not allowed to earn an economic profit, then it would be where the price equals the ATC. Now this is not productively efficient because the price isn't equal to the minimum ATC. It's just breaking even and earning a normal profit only, meaning zero economic profit. Remember, when there's zero economic profits, there still can be accounting profits. Total revenue is maximized when marginal revenue is zero. When marginal revenue is zero, the elasticity of demand is unitary elastic is equal to 1. So total revenue maximization is not the same as profit maximization. This just means that the price times quantity value is the greatest. It doesn't take into account the cost of production. Consumer surplus would become zero if we had a first-degree price discriminating monopolist. This would be a situation where all of the consumers in the market are paying the highest price that they're willing to pay for the good. That would get rid of the consumer surplus. So if everybody was paying different prices for the same exact product and every consumer was paying their highest price that they're willing to pay, that would be perfect price discrimination. So here, there's no more consumer surplus, and now that old consumer surplus, or a lot of the old consumer surplus, would turn into economic profit. Notice that the MC equals D point, so while there might be a socially optimal quantity of output being produced, it's not being sold at a socially optimal price because everybody's paying different prices. Word. Monopolistic competition. So monopolistic competition, that's like our oxymoron for this unit, where we have many firms that are selling differentiated products. So they're competing against one another. There's similarities between the products, but they're not identical. So we have monopolistic competition. Each of the firms here, maybe there's a dozen firms in the industry or a couple dozen firms in the industry, who knows? Each of those firms have some control over the price. So a lot of retailing, tends to fall under monopolistic competition, fast food, things of that nature. It's relatively easy for new sellers to enter the market. In the long run, the firm still breaks even, but the firms will experience something known as excess capacity, where we don't have productive efficiency, meaning that the average total cost can be lower by increasing output. Cool thing is visually, the monopolistically competitive firm graph looks just like a monopoly firm graph or an unregulated monopoly firm graph. If you want to nitpick a little bit, you would say that the demand was flatter or more elastic under monopolistic competition because there are many substitutes available. So the economic profit graph is pretty similar to the monopoly. The economic loss graph for monopolistic competition, pretty similar to monopoly. But the big difference visually would be the long-run equilibrium, which is one of the trickier ones to sketch out. Because here, the MR equals MC quantity, once you take the elevator up to the demand curve, that should correspond to the average total cost curve. Now, the average total cost curve is not at its lowest point there. The average total cost is at its lowest point at the marginal cost intersection. So the U-shaped ATC comes down, hits that price, continues to fall, hits its lowest point at the marginal cost intersection, and then rises. So long-run equilibrium, monopolistically competitive firms take in zero economic profits, they break even. Oligopoly, that's the fun stuff with game theory. A few powerful firms, can be a duopoly if you're working with basic game theory, or you could have 3 firms or 4 firms that take up about 70% of the entire market share. Each firm has a lot of control over the price. It's very difficult to compete under an oligopoly. Significant barriers to entry. The firm can profit in the long run. Firms are interdependent, meaning that their profits are going to be based on what their competitors decide to do in terms of output decisions. And so that's why we use game theory a lot when it comes to oligopoly. So here's just a classic example of a game theory matrix with clear dominant strategies, Nash equilibrium. It's a prisoner dilemma game. So for Totally Inc., if Totally Inc. pursues strategy A, we're going to say that the left payouts, the left payout in each of the cells, that corresponds to the firm on the left. And then the payouts on the right correspond to the firm on the top, the Awesome LLC. So for Totally Inc., Strategy A, if they perform Strategy A, they get $2,305, and that would be more than Totally Inc.'s Strategy B of $2,272 below. Also a Strategy A, $2,350 in the top right matrix. For Totally Inc., $2,350 is greater than $2,325 in the bottom right for Totally Inc. So Totally Inc.'s clear dominant strategy is to go Strategy A here. Awesome LLC, their numbers are the same, but we're comparing the right number in each of the cells. 2,305 in the top left for Awesome LLC is greater than 2,272 in the top right. And 2,350 for Awesome LLC in the bottom left is greater than 2,325 in the bottom right. So we would say Totally Inc.'s dominant strategy is Strategy A. Awesome LLC's dominant strategy is Strategy A. And the Nash equilibrium is when both of those firms play their dominant strategies. As long as one firm has a clear dominant strategy, it's easy to find the Nash equilibrium. We end up in the top left. Is it a prisoner dilemma game? We say yeah, because while in the Nash equilibrium, the two firms end up with $2,305. If we ended up in Strategy B in the bottom right, the firms would both receive more than the Nash equilibrium. So this is a prisoner dilemma type game. Sometimes it can be difficult to find a clear dominant strategy like you see here. Superco, if they go Strategy B, they might end up with $3,950, which is more than $2,450. However, $5,950 in the top right is more than $1,850 in the bottom right. So this is a situation where it's difficult to find what would be the dominant strategy. You can always say, if Duperco pursues Strategy B, then what's Superco's dominant strategy? That might be something that could be asked on the AP exam as well. All right, resource markets. This should be the stuff that's freshest in your mind because this is diminishing marginal returns. It's the labor markets. It's the last new material that we went over for this exam. So the marginal revenue product is the change in the total revenue product over the change in the quantity of the resources. Key definition there. Marginal revenue product is the resource demand for the product. So here you see the marginal product starts to decline after the second laborer is hired. That's diminishing marginal returns. And we actually sketched out the marginal product and average product curves when we started talking about the cost of production before we did the firms earlier in this presentation. So here, remember, working with a competitive labor market, the marginal revenue product is the firm's demand. Marginal revenue product is the marginal physical product, or marginal product. It means the same thing, marginal physical product, times the marginal revenue under perfect competition, which is the market price. The firm would maximize its profits from a resource hiring perspective as long as the marginal revenue product is greater than or equal to the marginal factor cost. A common marginal factor cost would be the wage rate if we're working with perfectly competitive labor. So in other words, the marginal revenue product divided by the price of that resource, marginal revenue product of the resource over the price of the resource, is equal to 1 whole. Profit maximizing rule for resource markets. So this is just a common depiction of what a perfectly competitive labor market or resource market would look like, side by side with the firm that's hiring from the perfectly competitive market. So here you see the marginal factor cost for the firm is the firm's labor supply. That wage is taken from the market. Markets set the wage, so the firm is the wage taker under perfectly competitive labor markets, and the marginal revenue product is the demand. So the marginal revenue product, the demand curve for labor, is derived from the product market, which then establishes the resource demand, and then that helps determine how many workers a firm would want to employ. This also applies to markets for capital and market for land, all markets for resources. When there's an increase in demand for a resource like labor, then it's the rightward shift of marginal revenue product. So if only this firm has access to some new technology that increases the marginal revenue product, the wage rate would stay the same for the firm, and they would employ more workers. Remember, if a firm can get more productive workers or more productive type of labor, the firm wants to hire more of the productive labor and less of the less productive labor. So that's why we say productivity is important for employment. If you want to be an employed worker, if you want to earn a decent wage, it's good to be a productive worker than a non-productive worker. Be a skilled laborer. Don't be an unskilled laborer is the moral of the story. If we're working with a monopsonistic type of labor market or an imperfectly competitive labor market, maybe it's an oligopsony where you only have a few powerful firms that are hiring a certain type of labor. Here the wage rate would be lower compared to perfectly competitive labor markets, and fewer workers would be hired. So if this was perfect competition, the supply would equal marginal revenue product. That would be the point where we would have employment and more employment at higher wages. But if a firm has hiring power, monopsony power, that means the marginal factor cost equals marginal revenue product. The MRP equals MFC rule is still at play, but they're going to pay each of those workers the lowest possible wage that they can, which is on the supply curve, because the supply establishes the wage rate. The people that are willing and able to work in the market. So MRP equals MFC is the point where that purple and the blue curves intersect, but the lowest possible wage is on the red supply curve. So that's the monopsony wage, and then that corresponds with the monopsonistic quantity of workers employed. Of course, the yellow region, that would represent the deadweight loss of the monopsony, because if it was a competitive labor market, we had many firms that were hiring labor, then we'd end up where supply equals MRP. The cost minimizing and profit maximizing formulas of resource combination. This is just like the marginal utility over the price of the good stuff we talked about with the consumer earlier in this review video. The marginal product of labor over the price of labor should equal the marginal product of capital over the price of capital. It's the cost minimizing formula. If you're working with profit maximization, the ratio should be equal to 1. Now, if you need the ratio, the left side or the right side, if you need the left side to be higher in value, then you would employ fewer of those workers. And if you wanted the ratio, the MRP over P or the MP over P to come down, you would employ more of those workers or employ more of those resources. All right. So when it comes to government involvement in the market and externalities, you shouldn't see too much of that on this year's exams from the information that I had seen. But just a quick little overview. If you're working with a price control, a ceiling, a binding ceiling that is below market equilibrium, you might see a situation similar to this that changes the level of consumer surplus. Consumers will pay less. However, there's going to be a shortage of housing under these circumstances, and over the long run, that shortage would get worse and worse as landlords would just stop fixing their apartments. A lot of them might even fall into disrepair, and then the shortage would worsen as the supply would decrease further. So a lot of failed historical examples of rent controls that we had looked at in class. Right? Per unit tariffs, we looked at this in the very beginning of micro. The DP represents the domestic price of the product, And here the WP represents the world price of the product. So if this was like the price of sugar or something like that, that's a common example. World price of sugar is low, domestic price of sugar is high. That means we can figure out, how much we would want to demand or import versus how much we would supply domestically, given the world price of sugar. So the quantity demanded at WP is much greater than the quantity supplied domestically at quantity P. So if the world's price with the tariff, WP plus T, is that middle line, we can calculate or kind of visualize what the tariff revenue would be and figure out the deadweight loss from the tariff. This is one of those instances where the deadweight loss isn't portrayed as that arrowhead that points toward the socially optimal level where supply equals demand. But here, I'm just showing the effects of the per unit tariff. I'm not going to say too much on negative and positive externalities here because I don't think it's going to be a key feature for this year's exam. But a negative externality occurs whenever a third party, somebody that is not the buyer or seller, is affected in a negative way from the sale or the consumption or the production of some good. So negative externality would be like you going to the store to buy a pack of cigarettes, light up the cigarette, you're like, oh yeah, that's a good cigarette, okay. And then you puff your smoke, and then I start coughing. No, that's a negative externality. I had nothing to do with the production or the consumption or the market transaction of that item, and now I'm suffering as a result. That's a negative externality. It's a market failure. So under those cases, social costs exceed the social benefit. That's a market failure. So what would make sense here to correct a negative externality would be if the government imposed a per unit tax on the sale or production of those types of goods. There's negative externalities. There's also positive externalities. There's some goods that are like really good for society and that we would want more, an increased production of goods with positive externalities. Like we like to think like education has a lot of positive externalities associated with it because if we're the smarter that we are, if you're going to college and you're going to do something really great with your life and you're going to invent something brand new and you're going to innovate and you're going to somehow make my life better off as a point. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that so cool? So we want more of that. We want more productive, more innovative thinkers. We want smarter people to innovate and develop cures and make the world better, easier, make things easier for us, more productive. Those are positive externalities. Like a good example, much different example, but a good example of a positive externality is like when my neighbor takes care of their lawn. So my neighbor, they have a really nice house, fancy siding on their house. It's beautiful. The landscape is pristine. Love it, love it. So they put a lot of time and effort into maintaining their lawn and the bushes and the flowers and the appearance of their house. It looks great. That's good for my property value. I had nothing to do with everything that they're doing, but it's improving my property value because everybody wants to live next to like the nice house, right? Meanwhile, my house is okay. It's definitely not as fancy as theirs. But if I let the lawn go for a few extra weeks, maybe my neighbor, I can imagine my neighbor not being too happy with that. So I enjoy the positive externalities of their nice home. That's good for my property value. But my home that's not as nice, perhaps, might be viewed as a negative externality from their perspective. So one way to correct positive externalities to get more of it would be to subsidize that type of behavior. Get more people to take care of their homes, take care of their lawns, because that improves the whole neighborhood, the neighborhood as a whole. Sound cool? Cool. Per unit taxes. Now this stuff we did talk about earlier in our discussion of micro. the textbook. So the effects of a per unit tax. So assuming that there's no externalities here that are being corrected, if there's a per unit tax or an excise tax on a specific product, we end up with this type of situation. Sometimes it's called a tax wedge even, where without the tax, we would end up at price point P in the middle, where supply equals demand. But then the price with the tax would bring us up to P1. However, the seller is going to receive PS. So the purple area is the deadweight loss from the per unit tax. That's areas 4 and 5 that you see there. Now the important thing to note here is that if the price was, say, $7 before the tax, and it's a $2 per unit tax, the price might only go up by $1. And the reason for that is that the seller is going to bear part of that tax burden as well. So box 2 that you see here, that yellow region, that represents the share of the tax that the buyer, the consumers, are paying. And then box 3, that green area that you see there, that's the area of the tax that the sellers are responsible for. So the tax burden is shared by consumers and producers. Now here it looks like the tax burden is shared equally, and that's because the elasticities of supply and demand here are pretty much the same. But if demand is more elastic than the supply curve, then the tax burden is going to fall more heavily, or the tax incidence falls more heavily on the seller, as you see in the top left. The bottom right, we have perfectly elastic demand. So here the seller would pay everything. If we had inelastic demand, in this case, demand is steeper than the supply curve, the buyer share of the tax is greater than the producer share. And if we had perfectly inelastic demand, then the buyer is responsible for all of the tax. So it's the tax incidence and elasticity, really important. And then just one quick final thought here, the final diagram. This is known as the Lorenz curve. It shows the area of income inequality of an economy. We look at it in terms of quintiles, like in terms of 20%, like bottom 20% of income, bottom 20% of households in the economy. But if the percentage of income in the entire economy is equal to the percent of households, we would end up with that pretty much 45-degree line that you see here. We'd have perfect income equality if our economy was that blue line. We'd have complete inequality if you would run through the red line that you see, the bottom. So the actual income distribution would be shown as a Lorenz curve, the purple line that you see there. So in this case, let's say it's very clear that if we're along the purple line, the bottom 20% of households does not take in 20% of the overall income in the economy, right? 50% of the households not taking 50% of the overall income. So the Gini coefficient, Gini ratio would be something that we would discuss with income inequality if we were still in school, and as we prepare for the AP micro test. So those are just some of the key diagrams, key formulas that you should pay attention to going into this 2020 exam. All right, I guess I'll catch up with you next week.